It was the political equivalent of a red card. In a direct public statement, the U.S. ambassador to Canada delivered the ultimatum. The threat was explicit. If Canada does not choose the American F-35, the foundational NORAD defense alliance, quote, would have to be altered. Suddenly, the national debate wasn't about fighter jets. It was a direct challenge to our sovereignty. A system check, confirming a quiet, strategic fear that the keys to our own continental defense are not, in fact, in our hands. But what if the answer to a political trap like this isn't a political argument? What if hundreds of miles away, a small team of engineers was about to render the entire game obsolete? To understand how to escape a political trap like that red card, the answer usually isn't found in another political argument. The answer lies in making the game itself obsolete. To see how, we have to look away from Ottawa and Washington and turn our attention to a quiet revolution happening in the world of aerospace. A revolution started by a single British company acting entirely on its own. They didn't just build a better jet engine, they created a new paradigm. For decades, the fundamental problem of hypersonic flight, going 5, 6, 7 times the speed of sound, was a problem of physics and brute force. You'd need a rocket to get you up to speed, then a scramjet could take over. 2 different systems, immense complexity, massive cost. This team solved it. They fused 3 different engine types, a jet, a rocket, and a scramjet, into a single, elegant system. It meant for the first time, a vehicle could take off from a normal runway, just like an airliner, accelerate past the speed of sound, and push all the way to Mach 7 in a single, sustained flight. Now let's just pause and visualize what that means. At Mach 7, you're not flying through the air anymore. You are fighting it. The friction on the aircraft's skin generates temperatures over 2,000 degrees Celsius. That is hot enough to soften industrial steel, hot enough to make aluminum lose all its structural integrity. The air itself becomes a plasma, a hostile obstacle trying to tear the machine apart. And this engine doesn't just survive that environment, it inhales it. It thrives in it. But the most disruptive part of this story isn't the temperature. It's where it happened. This was achieved outside the massive state-funded American technological ecosystem. It was a clear signal, the first in a generation, that dominance in the future of aerospace was no longer absolute, that a new path was possible. And it forces a critical question: who actually gets to decide who owns the future of speed? This breakthrough is more than just an engineering marvel. It's a strategic key. But what does a British engine have to do with Canada's ability to chart its own course? The answer has everything to do with the one place where speed and distance define survival: our Arctic. In the Arctic, the laws of physics are the only laws that matter. The distances are continental. The warning times are now measured in minutes. The old math of scrambling a jet from a southern base simply no longer works. When a threat can cross our sovereign airspace in the time it takes to brew a pot of coffee, holding a stopwatch is not a defense strategy. The British hypersonic engine breakthrough wasn't just an interesting headline in Ottawa. It dropped a new variable into a dangerously rigid equation. From Ottawa's side, the response was deliberate. Canada initiated a quiet approach to the independent British hypersonic team, opening a channel to explore a formal partnership rather than waiting to be folded into an American-led project. It happened in the same window that test data from the British engine was proving this was hardware, not hype. The thinking was straightforward. If hypersonic speed is going to define the next 50 years of security in the North, Canada needs access that doesn't require asking anyone's permission. A British-led partnership offered a different architecture: propulsion and mission systems governed by UK and Canadian law instead of US export regimes like ITAR, and data links that aren't hardwired to American encryption keys on networks such as Link 16. That's where the kill switches usually hide, not in a dramatic self-destruct button, but in software updates, weapons release permissions, and network access that can quietly be withheld from thousands of kilometers away. Let's be clear about the motive. This wasn't a gesture against the United States. It was an attempt to close a very specific dependency loop. Every time Canada buys a platform whose weapons, software, or data links are wrapped in U.S. export controls, Washington keeps a quiet veto over where it can fly, what it can carry, and who it can work with. A single policy shift in D.C. can act like a referee's red card. Suddenly, an upgrade is delayed, a sensor mode is restricted, or a mission profile is ruled off limits because the license terms no longer line up with America's priorities. Partnering into an independent hypersonic program is an attempt to step out of that trap, to build a future where a red card from Washington might be diplomatically awkward but not technologically fatal. It's the difference between being a customer inside someone else's system and being a co-owner of your own. Yes, that choice creates friction, but from a strategic planner's point of view, that friction is just an engineering cost you budget for to get something far more valuable. Independent decision-making at Mach 7. This is the long game. A Canada with a sovereign capacity to patrol its own Arctic at a speed no one can ignore. In that world, a radar track over the Northwest Passage isn't a worrying abstraction on a screen for hours. It's something you can reach, identify, and, if necessary, challenge while it's still in your sky. It shifts bargaining power as well. At NORAD tables, at NATO councils, and in any negotiation over northern routes, you sit as the country that can actually get aircraft to that strip of airspace fast enough to matter. But that entire future, that entire strategic opportunity hinges on a single choice we have to make right now. The grand vision is irrelevant if we fail a much smaller, more immediate test. A test buried not in the engine of the future, but in the black box mission systems and data links of the fighter jets we're choosing today. That future of hypersonic engines isn't being decided in a wind tunnel. It's being fixed quietly in Ottawa. It's a choice in the offices of our own government, where a fighter replacement slide deck is on the projector and NORAD liaison officers are walking senior staff through one line: network requirements. Canada's next fighter jet boils down to two options. On one side, the American F-35, a fifth-generation system bundled with the U.S. digital ecosystem it was built to live inside. On the other, Sweden's Saab Gripen E, a highly capable non-American alternative. On paper, this looks like a technical evaluation of speed, stealth, sensor fusion, and cost. In reality, you're choosing a control architecture that will govern Canadian air power for decades. The platform we bolt future weapons onto, including future hypersonic systems. More importantly, it will lock in who we must ask permission from every time we want weapons, sensors, or software to talk to our allies at full capacity. That is where one seemingly narrow line on those briefing slides keeps blowing up the entire conversation. A secure communication system called Link 16. If this were a mystery novel, Link 16 would be the murder weapon everyone overlooks until the final chapter. Think of it as the digital backbone of NORAD and NATO. It's the encrypted, jam-resistant tactical data link that lets a Canadian jet, an American AWACS, and a British warship all see and update the same live picture of the battlefield, flowing through standardized terminals like MIDS bolted into each aircraft. Without it, you're not just flying solo, you're flying blind inside an alliance that assumes constant data sharing. Here is the design feature that matters: the master crypto keys and the approval authority for those MIDS terminals, the core of the Link 16 architecture, are controlled by the United States. That control is the hidden handshake, an engineering reality inside the network that turns a sovereign procurement choice into a test of political alignment measured in encryption. At the time, the U.S. ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, made that leverage explicit. On the record, he warned that if Ottawa chose the Swedish Gripen instead of the American F-35, Washington could withhold approval for the Link 16 MIDS terminals our jets would need to use inside NORAD. The engineering itself becomes the gatekeeper. The official justification for this level of control is always the same word: interoperability. The idea that to be effective allies, our systems must be able to talk to each other. But what if there is direct proof from a real-world NATO mission that a non-American jet achieved full Link 16 interoperability without handing over the master keys to its own systems? There is, over the skies of Iceland. Once you see how that worked, the debate about Canada's fighters and who really holds the off switch looks very different. That proof comes from a desolate airbase in Keflavik, Iceland. It quietly dismantles the entire argument. The official story we are told from Washington is built on a single critical term, interoperability. The premise is that a non-American system, like Saab's Gripen, simply cannot integrate into the digital nervous system of NORAD, that it can't speak the same language or operate as a seamless node in the continental defense network. On paper, it sounds like a legitimate engineering constraint. If that were true, you would expect the same limitation to show up anywhere Allied jets have to plug into that shared network. But that premise runs into what actually happened between February and March of 2026. During that period, 6 Swedish JAS 39 Gripen fighters were deployed to lead NATO's Iceland air policing mission out of Keflavik. They were not operating in a vacuum. They were flying alongside Danish F-35's. This was not a training vignette on a whiteboard. It was a live NATO mission in real Arctic airspace. Long legs over cold ocean, sparse ground-based sensors, and a situation where your shared picture depends heavily on the data link doing its job. And the critical data network at the center of the Canadian debate, Link 16, did its job. NATO's Allied Air Command and CTV News both described successful joint data sharing and coordination. Swedish and Danish jets were sharing targeting information, aligning their flights, and operating as a unified formation over the very system we have been told is a proprietary, inaccessible lock. This is not a creative reinterpretation of a vague press release. The Swedish Air Force Major General Jonas Wickman stated it directly. Gripen E is fully able to integrate with any kind of sensor and information sharing cooperation. Taken together, the statement and the Iceland deployment show that, at least for the data link and sensor sharing layer, Gripen can be a fully functional node on the same Allied networks as the F-35 when it is allowed on. That does not magically grant Sweden or Canada automatic access to every classified tier inside the NORAD architecture. Those doors are still controlled politically, but it does undercut the specific technical claim used in Ottawa that a non-US fighter simply cannot be wired into the secure operational picture. Once you see Iceland, the technical alibi falls apart. When Gripen is given access to the network, it connects, shares, and fights alongside allied F-35's. The real gate is not the airframe or the avionics. It is whether someone else chooses to extend that digital handshake. That leaves one uncomfortable question on the table. When a nation's most important ally cites interoperability to block a sovereign choice, despite clear evidence that the underlying technology already works together, is that a legitimate security concern or a political power play using technology as a lever of control? If you want to treat this as a running debrief, lay out your view in the comments. I read them as part of the record. The Iceland Proof shows that the technical key already fits the lock. In that case, the key is simple: access to the Link 16 network, the authorization for those jets to join the same encrypted data picture as their allies. And if the public story that the key does not fit is a fiction, then the real question becomes, what is the actual mechanism of control? What system hidden behind the word interoperability enforces this dependency in practice? Because finding that system is how you stop arguing with the cover story and start mapping the real architecture of power. So, what is that architecture of power? It isn't built from steel or concrete. It's constructed from code, logistics, and permissions. The public imagination pictures a kill switch as a dramatic red button, a remote command that sends $100 million fighter jet spiraling from the sky. That image is comforting because it's clear and cinematic. The real mechanism of control is quieter. Export permissions, software keys, maintenance authorizations. You don't need to blow up a jet if you can quietly stop it from ever taking off at full strength. For a platform like the F-35, the leverage point isn't a hypothetical off switch hidden in the flight controls. It is embedded in the jet's central nervous system, a global sustainment and data network, originally branded Alice and now ODIN. Every F-35 is designed to feed into that system and depend on it. Here's how that loop actually works. After each flight, the aircraft pushes health, performance, and fault data into the network. That back-end system processes the information and spits out what the jet needs next, which parts to replace, which maintenance actions to schedule, which software patches to apply. On the other side of the loop, the same pipeline delivers mission data and threat libraries, the files that tell the jet which radars to recognize, which emitters to avoid, which signatures to treat as hostile. If that connection is slowed or severed, squadrons don't just lose convenience. Their day-to-day operations start to seize up. Faults stay uncleared, parts don't arrive, software and mission data stop evolving while the threat environment keeps moving. The United States doesn't micromanage every turn of a wrench, but it does control the core infrastructure that makes this loop possible. The servers, the software signing keys, and the update pipeline itself. Partners can input data and request outputs. They cannot independently rewrite the codebase that decides what is valid or generate their own officially recognized updates outside that ecosystem. Think of the aircraft as the world's most advanced smartphone. The airframe, engines, and stealth coding are the hardware. But its combat intelligence, its ability to identify a new enemy radar, to evade a new missile type, to communicate securely in a jammed environment. That all rides on software and data files being refreshed on a tight cycle. And for Canada's potential F-35 fleet, the U.S. would effectively be the system administrator with the password. On paper, Canada is a full partner in a trusted alliance. In practice, it would be a permissioned user on a U.S.-owned platform. Once you see it in those terms, the dependency is obvious. If the mission data files and software updates keep flowing, the jets remain what the brochure promises. If those updates lag or dry up, their survivability starts to erode. Sensors misclassify or simply fail to recognize newer threats. Electronic warfare suites keep countering yesterday's radars while today's systems slip through. The aircraft doesn't suddenly fall out of the sky, but it becomes easier to find, easier to target, and easier to kill. This is the real kill switch. It is not a button you press. It is a lifeline you can tighten. It is the ability to slow or withhold the digital and logistical support that keeps an ally's fleet fully lethal. You can degrade their operational readiness, shrink their room for independent action, and force them to wait for you to turn the tap back on, all without ever issuing a formal no. Now, with that architecture in mind, go back to that conversation from the beginning, the ambassador's quiet warning. Knowing how this sustainment system works, you can hear that moment differently. It wasn't a loud threat of future punishment. It was a calm reminder of existing terms and conditions, the quiet assertion of a system owner, reminding a user who really holds the keys. So what does it look like in practice when the system owner clarifies the terms and conditions? What happens when that quiet reminder of who holds the keys becomes a public statement? It looks like this. It looks like the U.S. Ambassador, Pete Hoekstra, stating plainly and publicly what would happen if Canada were to choose the Gripen. The warning was no longer about abstract logistical dependencies. It was about tangible physical consequences. He warned that such a choice would force fundamental revisions to NORAD. And then he delivered the payload. He stated that the United States might have to fly its own F-35's into Canadian airspace to, and this is the direct quote, fill the gaps. Let's just let that sit for a moment. This isn't an ally offering assistance. This is a formal diplomatic position where a procurement choice, a sovereign Canadian industrial decision, is directly linked to a potential violation of our own airspace. The very definition of a nation-state begins with the monopoly on force within its own borders. The implicit message here was that this fundamental principle was now a negotiable item on the alliance checklist, the hypothetical red card we talked about in the beginning. This was it. Flipped over, face up, on the table for everyone to see. It was no longer a metaphor. It was now a stated position. The threat was no longer an engineer's quiet warning about system access. It was made plain. But this confrontation, as stark as it is, forces a much deeper, more uncomfortable question. Because this isn't just about one jet or one ambassador's statement. It's about the precedent. When a nation is presented with a choice like this, a choice between a piece of advanced technology and the uncontested control of its own territory, the decision it makes doesn't just define the next decade of defense policy. It recalibrates the next generation's entire understanding of what sovereignty even means. If the last chapter left us asking what sovereignty means in a world of software-locked weapons, this is where the answer starts to take shape inside a fighter jet competition, not a philosophy textbook. On one side of the board sits the immense, barely veiled political pressure from our closest ally, a threat delivered with a diplomat's smile in Ottawa briefing rooms. On the other, Saab, the Swedish contender, lays down a different piece, a Canadian production hub, up to 10,000 jobs, 100% offset guarantees, and full intellectual property transfer. That puts Canada, not the manufacturers, in check. Take the F-35 under Allied signaling, and you get more than an aircraft. You lock in interoperability with the U.S. system and the software and supply chain dependence we unpacked in the last chapter. Take Saab's sovereignty package and you gain industrial depth and control over the code while signaling to Washington that you're willing to ignore their preferred option. Saab is explicit. No black boxes, no calling a foreign help desk to change a line of code. We would hold the keys. One path maximizes alliance comfort. The other, domestic control. This is the point where you have to zoom out, because the dependency model exposed in the F-35 case is not an awkward one-off in the fine print. It's the template for how state-of-the-art U.S. weapons are sold. We've seen the mechanics, mission systems you can't legally modify, updates that only flow from the original vendor, and contract language that makes clear the core software never becomes Canadian property. That kind of clause set, applied across any state-of-the-art U.S. weapons technology, is exactly what sits behind Ottawa's quieter push to boost domestic output and, in its own words, cut reliance on U.S. arms. The system is working exactly as designed. Advanced capability in exchange for permanent permission seeking. And if this is now the default at the cutting edge of air power, you should expect the same control through updates architecture to seep into other critical technologies over the next 5 to 10 years. Start with the hypersonic engines we opened with. If their digital guts are locked under the same rules, engine control software that only a foreign supplier can tune, guidance code that won't change without an external green light, then in a crisis, your fastest strike system can sit waiting for someone else's update. That's why this fighter decision is more than a procurement file. The choice Canada makes on a jet today sets the default for every similar negotiation over the next generation, whether on missiles, sensors, or those hypersonic engines. Normalize dependence once. And it becomes the assumed baseline. Pay up front for sovereignty once, and you can point back to it. And this isn't just our problem. Any government or private actor building strategy on a capability they don't fully control hits the same wall. Someone else may decide whether they get to use it. That conflict, the trade-off between deploying game-changing technology and letting someone else keep a finger on the off switch, was just stress-tested in public in the middle of a war by one of the most famous tech figures on the planet, Elon Musk. His test came when the Ukrainian military planned a submarine drone attack on Russia's fleet in Crimea. The strike relied on one backbone, Starlink. Ukrainian commanders asked Musk to extend coverage so their drones could reach the target. In that moment, a commercial satellite service became the guidance and communication system for a wartime operation. Musk said no, and he was explicit. If I had agreed to their request, then SpaceX would be explicitly complicit in a major act of war and conflict escalation. In that moment, a military operation wasn't decided in Kiev's war room. It was vetoed inside a tech CEO's risk calculus. Because he controlled the network, he controlled whether the operation even existed. If a network you don't own can stall an ally's strike, any state that builds its defense on external systems is running its sovereignty on borrowed permission. The Musk veto shows what happens whenever the off switch for a system sits outside your country. Your decision speed collapses to the comfort level of whoever holds it. That is the real fault line in our fighter jet story, because it was never just about one airframe versus another. The real variable isn't performance on paper, but who can deny you the networks, updates, and munitions that make the jet real. The same logic runs through every other critical system we rely on. Wherever the off switch is external, our sovereignty is conditional. So a serious technological sovereignty framework starts with 3 blunt questions. First, ownership. Who runs the critical layer? The network, software, or service this system depends on. Second, veto power. Who can legally or technically slow, limit, or shut it down in a crisis? Where does the off switch sit? Third, substitution. If that actor says no, how quickly can we route around them with domestic capacity or diversified alternatives? In Ukraine's case, all 3 answers pointed to Musk. He owned Starlink, held the veto, and there was no backup network ready. In Canada's case, when we buy fighters, sensors, or digital infrastructure on foreign-controlled networks, we should assume the same structure, unless we negotiate or build a way around it. So the essential question for our future isn't just what we buy, it's how we structure each deal so those 3 answers don't all live outside Canadian jurisdiction. The next time you hear about F-35 deliveries, NORAD upgrades, AUKUS submarines, or another interoperable service, run that check. Who owns the network, who holds the veto, and what happens if they say no? Use that framework and you jump past price debates to who holds the switch. For more deep dives that connect the technical details to the political reality, make sure to like and subscribe.